This is not a forest. This is one single plant. By 1925, this green wall had swallowed 60 million acres, an area larger than all of Great Britain. In Queensland, people woke up and realized they were trapped inside their own homes. Roads vanished under 20-foot spines. Cattle went blind and died after chewing the thorns out of hunger. Farmers left their land, their houses, and their machines behind, and they simply walked away. There was no way to stop it. An entire continent declared total war on a weed. They poured over 6 million pounds of arsenic poison onto it. They burned the land down to dead ash. They put government bounties on the heads of the birds that spread its seeds. But out of every chopped off piece, 3 more grew back. People threw everything they had at the plant and they lost completely. And the most frightening part of this story is that people brought the plant here themselves, on purpose, for the most expensive color in history and for a secret that people killed to protect. For centuries, the most expensive red color on Earth was made not from stone and not from a flower, but from an insect. To get 1 pound of dye, you had to crush about 70,000 dried bodies. Armies, cardinals, and kings were dressed in this color because red was not just a dye. It was the color of money and power. This dye brought the Spanish crown so much gold that in the entire New World, only silver beat it. And the crown guarded its secret more fiercely than the blueprints of its war galleons. Outsiders were not even told the main thing, that the dye is born from a living insect, the cochineal, which sits on one single plant, the cactus. For trying to smuggle this insect out alive, a person faced a charge of high treason and the death penalty, but the prize was so great that spies went hunting for the secret. In 1777, a French agent disguised as a merchant slipped into Spanish territory, stole cactus plants infected with the insect, and secretly carried them out of the country. The monopoly cracked. And then every empire wanted its own red factory far away from Spanish cannons. Britain was no exception. And when its ships carried the first settlers to the other side of the world, to Australia, the expedition also had a clear strategic task: to set up its own dye production and get around the Spanish monopoly. But you could only raise cochineal together with its one and only home, the cactus it lives on. So in Rio de Janeiro, the fleet commander Arthur Phillip buys a batch of cactus plants infected with the insect. The new colony at the edge of the world was meant to become the textile factory of the empire, to weave red army coats from its own raw material. But the plan failed. The delicate insect that gave the best dye could not survive the Australian heat and dryness, and it died out within a few seasons. But the cactus it sat on turned out to be far tougher than anyone expected. The insect that the whole thing was started for was dead, and its cactus stayed behind, on a foreign continent, without a single natural enemy, without diseases, without the insects that kept it in check back home. The empire came for the most expensive color in history, and it left Australia something it could never kill afterward by any means. When people finally understood that the cactus was out of control, they tried to destroy it. And that is when it turned out that this plant was protected from 4 sides at once, by its spines, by its broken pieces, by its thirst, and by the continent itself, which ended up on its side. Let us start with the spines. But the dangerous part is not the long needles you can see from far away. It is the glaucids, the tiny hairs at their base, gathered in tufts. Under a microscope, each one is covered in backward-facing barbs, like the tip of a harpoon. At the lightest touch, hundreds of these hairs dig into the flesh. You cannot pull them out. They break off under the skin and go deeper. Cattle that tried to chew the cactus out of hunger got the hairs in their gums, their tongues, and their eyes. The animals went blind, stopped eating, and died slowly and painfully from hunger, a few steps away from food they could not swallow. The second weapon is the immortality of its broken pieces. The cactus could not be killed by cutting it apart. Every broken piece that fell to the ground grew roots and became a new plant. Whoever chopped up the thicket was not destroying it, he was multiplying it. One strike of a shovel turned one plant into 10. The harder people cut the cactus, the thicker it came back. The third weapon was hidden inside. A normal plant opens its pores in the heat to breathe and loses water under the burning sun. The cactus does the opposite. During the day, its pores are sealed shut. It does not breathe, and it does not lose a single drop. It opens only at night, in the cool, when the air can no longer drink the moisture out of it. The drought that killed everything alive around it was nothing more than a resting period for this plant. It could dry down almost to a skeleton, lose a huge part of its mass, and then fill back up with water within a few hours after the first rain. And the fourth weapon was the most cunning of all. The cactus made the whole continent work for it. Its sweet fruit was eaten by birds, cows, and horses, which spread the seeds in their droppings for miles around. Its broken pieces were carried off by river floods, and every piece downstream became a new colony. Roads, rivers, livestock, and the farmers themselves, all of it turned into a transport network that spread the cactus faster than people could cut it down. It turned out that the continent was not fighting a weed. It was fighting an enemy that had turned animals, weather, water, and every attempt to destroy it against the continent itself. The fourth weapon of the cactus was Australia itself. And the cactus, meanwhile, was taking over 1 million acres a year. The cruelest part of this story is that the farmers let the enemy in themselves. For decades, the prickly pear was considered useful. They planted it around their fields as a living thorny fence. They fed it to cattle during droughts. They kept it as a pretty low-maintenance plant. People planted the cactus along every plot with their own hands, and they opened the gates for it into the heart of the continent themselves. The fence that was supposed to protect the field choked it instead. Everything was tried. The thickets were cut by hand, and they grew back from every broken piece. They were burned, and the ash fertilized the soil, and the cactus came back thicker than before. Heavy rollers pulled by oxen were driven over it to crush it into pulp, but the crushed pieces grew roots right where they fell. And when the soldiers came back from the front, the desperation got so bad that people even tried to use flamethrowers and converted tanks against the cactus. The continent was fighting a plant with the weapons of a world war, and it was losing every battle. The authorities announced a reward, first 5,000 pounds sterling, then 10. A huge fortune for that time to anyone who could figure out how to stop the green plague. Proposals poured in from all over the world. People suggested burying the cactus in salt, crushing it with steam machines, hitting it with electricity, burning it with a system of mirrors that focus sunlight into a single point. They even set a government bounty on the heads of the birds, the emus and the crows that spread the seeds in their droppings. Birds were killed by the thousands, yet the cactus kept growing. The main reward was never paid out because nothing worked, and then only chemicals were left. About 6 million pounds of arsenic poison and sulfuric acid were dumped onto the land. The cactus was stabbed with poison spears, each stem separately, by hand, thousands of times over. So much arsenic was needed that Queensland opened a whole new industry just to mine it. Workers were poisoned by the fumes the acid ate at their skin and lungs. And where the poison did work, it killed not only the cactus, it killed everything. The land turned into gray, dead slag, where nothing grew for decades. Arsenic is still found in the soil of these areas to this day. The locals gave the thickets a name that said it all, the Green Hell. In the end, they did the terrible math. Clearing the land of dense cactus cost 6 times more than the land itself was worth. Fighting was more expensive than giving up. The Land Commission admitted it plainly. No one would ever know what the scourge truly cost, in money, in abandoned homes, and in human lives. People lost everything they could possibly lose. But during those same years, in a laboratory in the middle of a dead forest of thorns, a young researcher was at work, one of the first women the Australian government ever hired for a scientific position. She was looking for the thing that had held this cactus in check on its home continent for millions of years. Everyone around her was trying to kill the plant from the outside, with fire, with iron, with poison. She understood that it had to be killed from the inside. Neither force nor poison had worked. Now it was biology's turn. And then the scientists asked a question that almost no one had wanted to ask before. If a human cannot defeat the cactus, then who already knows how to do it? To understand what Australia was risking, you only have to look at Hawaii. There, by exactly the same logic, people tried to stop the giant African snail by releasing a predator against it. The rosy wolf snail, one foreigner will eat the other. But the predator almost ignored its target. Instead of the pest, it went after the local native snails and wiped them out completely, erasing dozens of unique species from the face of the earth forever. And now, Australia was getting ready to release yet another foreigner onto its own continent. If the plan turned out to be wrong by even a fraction, then instead of being saved, the continent would get a second catastrophe on top of the first one. This was a game of Russian roulette with the whole continent at stake. The scientists reasoned like this. Back home, in both Americas, the cactus does not take over continents. Something holds it back. So they needed to find the very creature that keeps the prickly pear in check at home and bring it to Australia. Expeditions set out across both Americas. They gathered and tested more than 30 kinds of insects that fed on the cactus. And one candidate turned out to be perfect. A moth from Argentina whose caterpillars ate only the prickly pear. But before releasing a foreign species onto the continent, they put it through a cold and brutal test. The caterpillars were locked in cages with wheat, corn, fruit, and with native Australian plants, with everything they could possibly destroy if they switched. The caterpillars did not touch a single thing. They would rather starve to death next to food than eat anything but the cactus. This was the perfect caliber, a weapon that physically cannot miss its target. And this weapon worked in a cunning way. The female laid her eggs not scattered around, but in a chain that copied the exact shape of a cactus spine, so the plant could not recognize it. The larvae hatched and burrowed into the stem as a colony. And there, hidden from any poison and any knife, they ate the cactus from the inside, leaving only oozing wounds and yellowing on the outside. Old-timers later recalled that on windless nights, on the edges of the infested areas, there was a quiet, dry rustling. It was millions of jaws grinding through the cactus fibers at once in the dark. This was not a fairy tale about a moth that flew in and saved a continent, but a cold industrial operation. 3,000 eggs were brought from Argentina, but the first attempts to breed moths from them failed. It worked only on the next attempt, and after that, the colony grew like an avalanche. Each new generation produced dozens of times more eggs than the one before. At the experimental station in Chinchilla, they built a real factory of life. At its peak, it was shipping out up to 14 million eggs a day across Queensland and New South Wales. Farmers and officials attached paper strips with eggs onto the thickets by hand. The whole country was pasting its own salvation onto the cactus. And the green wall slowly began to fall. The cactus, eaten from the inside, lost the internal water pressure that held it up and collapsed under its own weight. 20-foot fortresses turned into black, rotting mush within a few days, and then dried down to the state of thin gray paper. The poison had killed the land around the cactus. The caterpillars killed the cactus itself. In less than 10 years, the thing happened that fire, iron, and 6 million pounds of poison had never achieved. By scientists' estimates, the tiny caterpillars ate about 1.5 billion tons of cactus. By the start of the 1930s, just a few years after the first release, the green wall had collapsed into rot. And by 1940, of the invader that had covered an area larger than Britain, only about 5% was left. The land was given back to the people. Towns that had frozen during the years of the green hell came back to life, and wheat grew again on the reclaimed fields. And the grateful farmers did something that has almost never been done in history. They put up a monument to an insect. In Bunarga, there still stands a hall named after the moth that saved their region. But in this cleanup, the moth had one more quiet ally. It was not the moth alone that finished off the cactus. Working beside it was the cochineal insect, a relative of the very bug the whole disaster was started for. Only now its tougher relatives had been brought into Australia, and they latched onto the cactus for good, sucking it dry from the outside. It seemed like the story had ended there. The continent had won back its land from a plant that neither fire nor poison could touch. Fields, herds, and homes returned to where a solid wall of spines had stood not long before. People had stepped into nature, and it seemed they had won. But nature has no victory button. The moth could not destroy the cactus completely, and it was not supposed to. If it ate the last prickly pear, it would die itself from hunger. So a fragile balance set in, an endless seesaw. The cactus spreads, the moth multiplies and eats it down. The cactus nearly disappears, the moth dies off, and the cactus raises its head again. The war did not end. It just moved into a quiet, endless phase that has to be controlled to this day. And then it turned out that the balance was even more delicate. Other kinds of prickly pear took hold in Australia too, the ones the moth simply does not attack. It leaves them alone, and they still have to be destroyed by hand and with chemicals. The perfect weapon turned out to be perfect against only one target, and there was no eternal peace. But the real crack was not here. While Australia was learning to live with its cactus, the weapon forged in Chinchilla no longer belonged to Australia alone. The same moth had been brought in to save fields in other countries, and from there, it broke loose, and it went where no one was waiting for it. In 1989, the very moth that had saved Australia was spotted in Florida. No one released it there on purpose. It came on its own, crossing from island to island across the Caribbean Sea. And it reached a continent where cacti are not invaders, where the prickly pear has been growing at home for millions of years already. On the cactus's home ground, everything is the other way around. Here, the prickly pear is a pillar of the ecosystem. Birds, tortoises, and insects feed on it. A whole layer of desert life rests on it. And into this system came a creature the local cacti have no defense against. What had been medicine in Australia became a disease here. The moth moved across the southern United States, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, eating the native prickly pear from the inside, exactly the way it once ate the invaders in Australia. And beyond Texas lies Mexico. There, the prickly pear is not just a wild plant. It is food. It is plantations. It is an industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And a creature that knows how to wipe the cactus off the face of the earth is closing in on its border from the American side. Mexico is holding the line. Every outbreak of the moth is tracked and exterminated, so it cannot take hold. A whole country has been fighting a little moth for years, the very same one that was given a monument in Australia. And here is the whole point. The moth is neither evil nor good. It has not changed one bit. Only one thing changed: the place. In one ecosystem, the very same species becomes a surgeon that cuts out a tumor. In another, an executioner that kills a healthy body. The difference between salvation and catastrophe is nothing more than geography. The victory over the cactus went to Australia's head. The authorities and the scientists decided that they had fully mastered the laws of biology, that an ecosystem is a machine where you can swap out any part, and the price for that arrogance came due immediately. In 1935, pointing directly to the triumph of the moth, the government decides to save the sugarcane plantations from a beetle pest. They look for a solution by the old method: bring in a foreign predator. A total of 102 toads are brought from Hawaii. They are bred in captivity, and more than 2,000 are released into the wild, without even checking whether the toad would eat the beetle the whole thing was started for at all. The only one who publicly spoke out against it was an old entomologist, Walter Froggatt. He warned plainly that this toad, which has almost no enemies here, which eats anything and breeds all year round, could become as great a disaster for Australia as rabbits or as the cactus itself. His fellow scientists laughed him down. Decades later, the cane toad would take over nearly 400,000 square miles of the continent, and its poison would begin wiping out local predators by whole populations. But in 1935, people just laughed at Froggatt because humanity had just beaten the cactus. and was absolutely certain that it could now command nature itself. But that is a whole other story. If you want it to be the next one, write about it in the comments.